Wage, Labour and Capital by Karl Marx. First published in Neue Rheinische Zeitung, 1849. Chapter 1. From various quarters we have been reproached with not having presented the economic relations which constitute the material foundation of the present class struggles and national struggles. We have designedly touched upon these relations only where they directly force themselves to the front in political conflicts. The point was, above all, to trace the class struggle in current history, and to prove empirically, by means of the historical material already at hand, and which is being newly created daily, that, with the subjugation of the working class, which had created the events of February and March, its opponents were simultaneously defeated, the bourgeois republicans in France, and the bourgeois and peasant classes which were fighting feudal absolutism throughout the continent of Europe. That the victory of the honest republic in France was at the same time the downfall of the nations that have responded to the February Revolution by heroic wars of independence. Finally, that Europe, with the defeat of the revolutionary workers, had relapsed into its old double slavery, the Anglo-Russian slavery. The June struggle in Paris, the fall of Vienna, the tragicomedy of Berlin's November 1848, the desperate exertions of Holland, Italy and Hungary, the starving of Ireland into submission. These were the chief factors which characterized the European class struggle between bourgeoisie and working class, and by means of which we provided that every revolutionary upheaval, however remote from the class struggle its goal may appear to be, must fail until the revolutionary working class is victorious. That every social reform remains a utopia until the proletarian revolution and the feudalistic counter-revolution cross swords in a world war. In our presentation, as in reality, Belgium and Switzerland were tragicomic genre pictures akin to the caricature in the great historical tableau, the one being the model state of the bourgeois monarchy, the other the model state of the bourgeois republic, both of them states which imagine themselves to be as independent of the class struggle as of the European Revolution. Now, after our readers have seen the class struggle develop in colossal political forms in 1848, the time has come to deal more closely with the economic relations themselves on which the existence of the bourgeoisie and its class rule, as well as the slavery of the workers, are founded. We shall present in three large sections. 1. The relation of wage labour to capital, the slavery of the worker, the domination of the capitalist. 2. The inevitable destruction of the middle bourgeois classes and of the so-called burgher estate under the present system. 3. The commercial subjugation and exploitation of the bourgeois classes of the various European nations by the despot of the world market, England. We shall not try to make our presentation as simple and popular as possible, and shall not presuppose even the most elementary notions of political economy. We wish to be understood by the workers. Moreover, the most remarkable ignorance and confusion of ideas prevails in Germany in regard to the simplest economic relations, from the accredited defenders of the existing state of things down to the socialist miracle workers and the unrecognized political geniuses in which fragmented Germany is even richer than in sovereign princes. Now, therefore, for the first question. What are wages? How are they determined? If workers were asked, "What are your wages?" one would reply, "I get a mark a day from my boss," another, "I get 2 marks," and so on. According to the different trades to which they belong, they would mention different sums of money which they receive from their respective bosses for the performance of a particular piece of work, for example, weaving a yard of linen, or typesetting a printed sheet. In spite of the variety of their statements, they would all agree on one point. Wages are the sum of money paid by the capitalist for a particular labour time, or for a particular output of labour. The capitalist, it seems, therefore, buys their labour with money. They sell him their labour for money. But this is merely the appearance. In reality, what they sell to the capitalist for money is their labour power. The capitalist buys this labour power for a day, a week, a month, etc., and after he has bought it, he uses it by having the workers work for the stipulated time. For the same sum with which the capitalist has bought their labour power, for example, 2 marks, He could have bought 2 pounds of sugar, or a definite amount of any other commodity. The 2 marks with which he bought 2 pounds of sugar are the price of the 2 pounds of sugar. The 2 marks which he bought 12 hours use of the labour power are the price of 12 hours labour. Labour power, therefore, is a commodity, neither more nor less than sugar. The former is measured by the clock, the latter by the scales. The workers exchange their commodity, labour power, for the commodity of the capitalist, for money, and this exchange takes place in a definite ratio. So much money for so long a use of labour power. For 12 hours weaving, 2 marks. And do not the 2 marks represent all the other commodities which I can buy for 2 marks? In fact, therefore, the worker has exchanged his commodity, labour power, for other commodities of all kinds, and that in a definite ratio. By giving him 2 marks, the capitalist has given him so much meat, so much clothing, so much fuel, light, etc., in exchange for his day's labour. Accordingly, the 2 marks express the ratio in which labour power is exchanged for other commodities, the exchange value of his labour power. The exchange value of a commodity, reckoned in money, is what we call its price. Wages are only a special name for the price of labour power, commonly called the price of labour, for the price of this peculiar commodity, which has no other repository than human flesh and blood. Let us take any worker, say a weaver. The capitalist supplies him with the loom and yarn. The weaver sets to work, and the yarn is converted into linen. The capitalist takes possession of the linen and sells it, say, for 20 marks. Now, are the wages of the worker a share in the linen, in the 20 marks, in the product of his labour? By no means. Long before the linen is sold, perhaps long before its weaving is finished, the weaver has received his wages. The capitalist, therefore, does not pay these wages with the money which he will obtain from the linen, but with money already in reserve. Just as the loom and the yarn are not the product of the weaver, to whom they are supplied by his employer, so likewise with the commodities, which the weaver receives in exchange for his commodity, labour power. It was possible that his employer found no purchaser at all for his linen. It was possible that he did not get even the amount of the wages by its sale. It is possible that he sells it very profitably in comparison with the weaver's wages. All that has nothing to do with the weaver. The capitalist buys the labour power of the weaver with a part of his available wealth, of his capital, just as he has bought the raw material, the yarn, and the instrument of labour, the loom, with another part of his wealth. After he has made these purchases, and these purchases include the labour power necessary for the production of linen, he produces only with the raw materials and instruments of labour belonging to him. For the latter include now, true enough, our good weaver as well, who has as little share in the product or the price of the product as the loom has. Wages are, therefore, not the worker's share in the commodity produced by him. Wages are the part of already existing commodities with which the capitalist buys a definite amount of productive labour power as such. Labour power is, therefore, a commodity which its possessor, the wage worker, sells to capital. Why does he sell it? In order to live. But the exercise of labour power, labour, is the worker's own life activity, the manifestation of his own life. And this life activity he sells to another person in order to secure the necessary means of subsistence. Thus, his life activity is for him only a means to enable him to exist. He works in order to live. He does not even reckon labour as part of his life. It is rather a sacrifice of his life. It is a commodity which he has made over to another. Hence also, the product of his activity is not the object of his activity. What he produces for himself is not the silk that he weaves, not the gold that he draws from the mine, not the palace that he builds. What he produces for himself is wages, and silk, gold, palace resolve themselves for him into a definite quantity of the means of subsistence, perhaps into a cotton jacket, some copper coins, and a lodging in a cellar. And the worker, who for 12 hours weaves, spins, drills, turns, builds, shovels, breaks stones, carries loads, etc., does he hold his 12 hours weaving, spinning, drilling, tuning, building, shoveling, stone breaking to be a manifestation of his life, to be life? On the contrary, life begins for him where this activity ceases, at table, in the tavern, in bed. The 12 hours' labour, on the other hand, has no meaning for him, as weaving, spinning, drilling, etc., but as earnings, which bring him to the table, to the tavern, into bed. If the silkworm were to spin in order to continue its existence as a caterpillar, it would be a complete wage worker. Labour power was not always a commodity. Labour was not always wage labour, that is, free labour. The slave did not sell his labour power to the slave owner any more than the ox sells its services to the peasant. The slave, together with his labour power, is sold once and for all to his owner. He is a commodity which can pass from the hand of one owner to that of another. He is himself a commodity, but the labour power is not his commodity. The serf sells only a part of his labour power. He does not receive a wage from the owner of the land. Rather, the owner of the land receives a tribute from him. The serf belongs to the land and renders to the owner of the land the fruits thereof. The free labourer, on the other hand, sells himself, and indeed sells himself piecemeal. He auctions off 8, 10, 12, 15 hours of his life, day after day, to the highest bidder, to the owner of raw materials, instruments of labour, and means of subsistence, that is, to the capitalist. The worker belongs neither to an owner nor to the land, but 8, 10, 12, 15 hours of his daily life belong to him who buys them. The worker leaves the capitalist, to whom he hires himself whenever he likes, and the capitalist discharges him whenever he thinks fit, as soon as he no longer gets any profit out of him, or not the anticipated profit. But the worker, whose sole source of livelihood is the sale of his labour power, cannot leave the whole class of purchasers, that is, the capitalist class, without renouncing his existence. He belongs not to this or that capitalist, but to the capitalist class, and moreover, it is his business to dispose of himself, that is, to find a purchaser within this capitalist class. Now, before going more closely into the relation between capital and wage labour, we shall present briefly the most general relations which come into consideration in the determination of wages. Wages, as we have seen, are the price of a definite commodity, of labour power. Wages are, therefore, determined by the same laws that determine the price of every other commodity. The question, therefore, is, how is the price of a commodity determined? Chapter 2. By what is the price of a commodity determined? By the competition between buyers and sellers, by the relation of demand to supply, of want to offer. Competition, by which the price of a commodity is determined, is free-sided. The same commodity is offered by various sellers. With goods of the same quality, the one who sells most cheaply is certain of driving the others out of the field and securing the greatest sale for himself. Thus, the sellers mutually contend among themselves for sales, for the market. Each of them desires to sell as much as possible, and, if possible, to sell alone, to the exclusion of the other sellers. Hence, one sells cheaper than another. Consequently, competition takes place among the sellers, which depresses the price of the commodities offered by them. But competition also takes place among the buyers, which in its turn cause the commodities offered to rise in prices. Finally, competition occurs between buyers and sellers. The former desire to buy as cheaply as possible, the latter to sell as dearly as possible. The result of this competition between buyers and sellers will depend upon how the two above-mentioned sides of the competition are related. That is, whether the competition is stronger in the army of buyers or in the army of sellers. Industry leads two armies into the field against each other, each of which again carries on a battle within its own ranks, among its own troops. The army whose troops beat each other up the least gains the victory over the opposing host. Let us say there are 100 bales of cotton on the market, and at the same time, buyers for 1,000 bales of cotton. In this case, therefore, the demand is 10 times as great as the supply. Competition will be very strong among the buyers, some of whom desire to get one, and if possible all, of the 100 bales for himself. This example is no arbitrary assumption. We have experienced periods of cotton crop failure in the history of trade, when a few capitalists and alliances have tried to buy not 100 bales, but all the cotton stocks of the world. Hence, in the example mentioned, one buyer will seek to drive the other from the held by offering a relatively higher price per bale of cotton. The cotton sellers, who see that the troops of the enemy army are engaged in the most violent struggle among themselves, and that the sale of all their 100 bales is absolutely certain, will take good care not to fall out among themselves and depress the price of cotton at the moment when their adversaries are competing with another to force it up. Thus, peace suddenly descends on the army of the sellers. They stand facing the buyers as one man, fold their arms philosophically, and there would be no bounds to their demands were it not that the offers of even the most persistent and eager buyers have very definite limits. If, therefore, the supply of a commodity is lower than the demand for it, then only slight competition, and none at all, takes place among the sellers. In the same proportion as this competition decreases, competition increases among the buyers. The result is a more or less considerable rise in commodity prices. It is well known that the reverse case, with a reverse result, occurs more frequently. Considerable surplus of supply over demand, desperate competition among the sellers, lack of buyers, disposal of goods at ridiculously low prices. But what is the meaning of a rise, a fall in prices? What is the meaning of high price, low price? A grain of sand is high when examined through a microscope, and a tower is low when compared with a mountain. And if price is determined by the relation between supply and demand, what determines the relation between supply and demand? Let us turn to the first bourgeois we meet, who will not reflect for an instant, but, like another Alexander the Great, will cut this metaphysical knot with the multiplication table. If the production of goods which I sell has cost me 100 marks, he will tell us, and if I get 110 marks from the sale of these goods, within the year of course, then that is sound, honest, legitimate profit. But if I get in exchange 120 or 130 marks, that is high profit, and if I get as much as 200 marks, that would be an extraordinary and enormous profit. What, therefore, serves the bourgeois as his measure of profit? The cost of production of his commodity. If he receives in exchange for this commodity an amount of other commodities which it has cost less to produce, he has lost. If he receives in exchange for his commodity an amount of other commodities the production of which has cost more, he has gained. And he calculates the rise and fall of profit according to the degree in which the exchange value of his commodity stands above or below zero, the cost of production. We have thus seen how the changing relation of supply and demand causes now a rise and now a fall of prices, now high, now low prices. If the price of a commodity rises considerably because of inadequate supply, or disproportionate increase of the demand, the price of some other commodity must necessarily have fallen proportionally, for the price of a commodity only expresses in money the ratio in which other commodities are given in exchange for it. If, for example, the price of a yard of silk material rises from 5 marks to 6, the price of silver in relation to silk has fallen, and likewise, the prices of all commodities that have remained at their old prices have fallen in relation to silk. One has to give a larger amount of them in exchange to get the same amount of silks. What will be the consequence of the rising price of a commodity? A mass of capital will be thrown into that flourishing branch of industry, and this influx of capital into the domain of the favoured industry will continue until it yields the ordinary profits, or, rather, until the price of its products, through overproduction, sinks below the cost of production. Conversely, if the product of a commodity falls below its cost of production, capital will be withdrawn from the production of this commodity. Except in the case of a branch of industry which has become obsolete and must, therefore, perish, the production of such a commodity, that is, its supply, will go on decreasing owing to this flight of capital until it corresponds to the demand, and consequently, its price is again on a level with its cost of production, or, rather, until the supply has sunk below demand, that is, until its price rises again above its cost of production, for the current price of a commodity is always either above or below its cost of production. We see how capital continually migrates in and out of the domain of one industry and into that of another. High prices bring too great an immigration, and low prices too great an emigration. We could show from another point of view how not only supply but also demand is determined by the cost of production, but this would take us too far away from our subject. We have just seen how the fluctuations of supply and demand continually bring the price of a commodity back to the cost of production. The real price of a commodity, it is true, is always above or below its cost of production, but rise and fall reciprocally balance each other, so that within a certain period of time, taking the ebb and flow of the industry together, Commodities are exchanged for one another in accordance with their cost of production, their price, therefore, being determined by their cost of production. This determination of price by cost of production is not to be understood in the sense of the economists. The economists say that the average price of commodities is equal to the cost of production, that this is a law. The anarchical movement, in which rise is compensated by fall and fall by rise, is regarded by them as chance. With just as much right, one could regard the fluctuations as the law and the determination by the cost of production as chance, as has actually been done by other economists. But it is solely these fluctuations which, looked at more closely, bring with them the most fearful devastation and, like earthquakes, cause bourgeois society to tremble to its foundations. It is solely in the course of these fluctuations that prices are determined by the cost of production. The total movement of this disorder is its order. In the course of this industrial anarchy, in this movement, in a circle, competition compensates, so to speak, for one excess by means of another. We see, therefore, that the price of a commodity is determined by its cost of production in such a manner that the periods in which the price of the commodity rises above its cost of production are compensated by the periods in which it sinks below the cost of production, and vice versa. This does not hold good, of course, for separate, particular industrial products, but only for the whole branch of industry. Consequently, it also does not hold good for the individual industrialist, but only for the whole class of industrialists. The determination of price by the cost of production is equivalent to the determination of price by the labour time necessary for the manufacture of a commodity. For the cost of production consists of 1. Raw materials and depreciation of instruments, that is, of industrial products, the production of which has cost a certain amount of labour days, and which, therefore, represent a certain amount of labour time. And 2. Direct labour, the measure of which is, precisely, time. Now, the same general laws that regulate the price of commodities, in general, of course, also regulate wages, the price of labour. Wages will rise and fall according to the relation of supply and demand, according to the turn taken by the competition between the buyers of labour power, the capitalist, and the sellers of labour power, the workers. The fluctuations in wages correspond in general to the fluctuation in prices of commodities. Within these fluctuations, however, the price of labour will be determined by the cost of production, by the labour time necessary to produce this commodity, labour power. What, then, is the cost of production of labour power? It is the cost required for maintaining the worker as a worker and of developing him into a worker. The less the period of training, therefore, that any work requires, the smaller is the cost of production of the worker, and the lower is the price of his labour, his wages. In those branches of industry, in which hardly any period of apprenticeship is required, and where the mere bodily existence of the worker suffices, the cost necessary for his production is almost confined to the commodities necessary for keeping him alive and capable of working. The price of his labour, therefore, will be determined by the price of the necessary means of subsistence. Another consideration, however, also comes in. The manufacturer, in calculating his costs of production and, accordingly, the price of the products, takes into account the wear and tear of the instruments of labour. If, for example, a machine costs him 1,000 marks and wears out in 10 years, he adds 100 marks annually to the price of commodities, so as to be able to replace the worn-out machine by a new one at the end of 10 years. In the same way, in calculating the cost of production of simple labour power, there must be included the cost of reproduction, whereby the race of workers is enabled to multiply and to replace worn-out workers by new ones. Thus, the depreciation of the worker is taken into account in the same way as the depreciation of the machine. The cost of production of simple labour power, therefore, amounts to the cost of existence and reproduction of the worker. The price of this cost of existence and reproduction constitutes wages. Wages so determined are called the wage minimum. This wage minimum, like the determination of the price of commodities by the cost of production in general, does not hold good for the single individual, but for the species. Individual workers, millions of workers, do not get enough to be able to exist and reproduce themselves, but the wages of the whole working class level down, within their fluctuations, to this minimum. Now that we have arrived at an understanding of the most general laws which regulate wages, like the price of any other commodity, we can go into our subject more specifically. Chapter 3. Capital consists of raw materials, instruments of labour, and means of subsistence of all kinds, which are utilised in order to produce new raw materials, new instruments of labour, and new means of subsistence. All these component parts of capital are creations of labour, products of labour, accumulated labour. Accumulated labour, which serves as a means of new production, is capital. So say the economists. What is a Negro slave? A man of the black race. The one explanation is good as the other. A Negro is a Negro. He only becomes a slave in certain relations. A cotton-spinning jenny is a machine for spinning cotton. It becomes capital only in certain relations. Torn from these relations, it is no more capital than gold in itself is money, or sugar the price of sugar. In production, men not only act on nature, but also on one another. They produce only by cooperating in a certain way, and mutual exchanging their activities. In order to produce, they enter into definite connections and relations with one another, and only within these social connections and relations does their action on nature, does production, take place. These social relations into which the producers enter with one another, the conditions under which they exchange their activities and participate in the whole act of production, will naturally vary according to the character of the means of production. With the invention of a new instrument of warfare, firearms, the whole internal organization of the army necessarily changed. The relationships within which individuals can constitute an army and act as an army were transformed, and the relations of different armies to one another were also changed. Thus, the social relations within which individuals produce, the social relations of production, change, are transformed, with the change and development of the material means of production, the productive forces. The relations of production in their totality constitute what are called the social relations, society, and, specifically, a society at a definite stage of historical development, a society with a peculiar, distinctive character. Ancient society, feudal society, bourgeois society, are such totalities of production relations, each of which at the same time notes a special stage of development in the history of mankind. Capital, also, is a social relation of production. It is a bourgeois production relation, a production relation of bourgeois society. Are not the means of subsistence, the instruments of labour, the raw materials of which capital consists, produced and accumulated under given social conditions in definite social relations? Are they not utilised for new production under given social conditions in definite social relations? And is it not just this definite social character which turns the products serving for new production into capital? Capital consists not only of means of subsistence, instruments of labour and raw materials, not only of material products. It consists just as much of exchange values. All the products of which it consists are commodities. Capital is therefore not only a sum of material products, it is a sum of commodities, of exchange values, of social magnitudes. Capital remains the same, whether we put cotton in place of wool, rice in place of wheat, or steamships in place of railways, provided only that the cotton, the rice, the steamships, the body of capital, have the same exchange value, the same price as the wool, the wheat, the railways, in which it was previously incorporated. The body of capital can change continually without the capital suffering the slightest alteration. But while all capital is a sum of commodities, that is, of exchange values, not every sum of commodities, of exchange values, is capital. Every sum of exchange value is an exchange value. Every separate exchange value is a sum of exchange values. For instance, a house that is worth 1,000 marks is an exchange value of 1,000 marks. A piece of paper that is worth a pfennig is a sum of exchange values of 1/100th of a pfennig. Products which are exchangeable for others are commodities. The particular ratio in which they are exchangeable constitutes their exchange value, or expressed in money, their price. The quantity of these products can change nothing in their quality of being commodities, or representing an exchange value, or having a definite price. Whether a tree is large or small, it is a tree. Whether we can exchange iron for other products in ounces or in hundredweights, does this make any difference in its character as a commodity, as exchange value? It is a commodity of greater or lesser value, of higher or lower price, depending upon the quantity. How then does any amount of commodities, of exchange values, become capital? By maintaining and multiplying itself as an independent social power, that is, as the power of a portion of society, by means of its exchange for direct living labour power. The existence of a class which possesses nothing but its capacity to labour is a necessary prerequisite of capital. It is only the domination of accumulated, past, materialised labour over direct living labour that turns accumulated labour into capital. Capital does not consist in accumulated labour serving living labour as a means for new production. It consists in living labour serving accumulated labour as a means for maintaining and multiplying the exchange value of the latter. What takes place in the exchange between the capitalist and wage worker? The worker receives means of subsistence in exchange for his labour power, but the capitalist receives in exchange for his means of subsistence, labour, the productive activity of the worker, the creative power, whereby the worker not only replaces what he consumes, but gives to the accumulated labour a greater value than it previously possessed. The worker receives a part of the available means of subsistence from the capitalist. For what purpose do these means of subsistence serve him? For immediate consumption. As soon, however, as I consume the means of subsistence, they are irretrievably lost to me, unless I use the time during which I am kept alive by them in order to produce new means of subsistence, in order, during consumption, to create by my labour new values in place of the values which perish in being consumed. But it is just this noble reproductive power that the workers surrender to the capitalist in exchange for means of subsistence received. He has, therefore, lost it for himself. Let us take an example. A tenant farmer gives his day labourer 5 silver groschen a day. For these 5 silver groschen, the labourer works all day on the farmer's field, and thus secures himself a return of 10 silver groschen. The farmer not only gets the value replaced that he has to give to the day labourer, he doubles it. He has therefore employed, consumed, the 5 silver groschen that he gave to the labourer in a fruitful, productive manner. He has bought with the 5 silver groschen just that, labour and power of the labourer, which produces agricultural products of double value and makes 10 silver groschen out of 5. The day labourer, on the other hand, receives in place of his productive power, the effect of which he has bargained away to the farmer, 5 silver groschen, which he exchanges for means of subsistence, and these he consumes with greater or lesser rapidity. The 5 silver groschen have, therefore, been consumed in a double way, reproductively for capital, for they have been exchanged for labour power, which produced 10 silver groschen, and unproductively for the worker, for they have been exchanged for means of subsistence, which have disappeared forever, and the value of which he can only recover by repeating the same exchange with the farmer. Thus, capital presupposes wage labour. Wage labour presupposes capital. They reciprocally condition the existence of each other. They reciprocally bring forth each other. Does a worker in a cotton factory produce merely cotton textiles? No, he produces capital. He produces values which serve afresh to command his labour, and by means of it, to create new values. Capital can only increase by exchanging itself for labour power, by calling wage labour to life. The labour power of the wage worker can only be exchanged for capital by increasing capital, by strengthening the power whose slave it is. Hence, increase of capital is increase of the proletariat, that is, of the working class. The interests of the capitalist and those of the worker are, therefore, one and the same, assert the bourgeois and their economists. Indeed, the worker perishes if capital does not employ him. Capital perishes if it does not exploit labour power, and in order to exploit it, it must buy it. The faster capital intended for production, productive capital, increases, the more, therefore, industry prospers, the more the bourgeoisie enriches itself, and the better businesses, the more the worker does the capitalist need, the more dearly does the worker sell himself. The indispensable condition for a tolerable situation of the worker is, therefore, the fastest possible growth of productive capital. But what is the growth of productive capital? Growth of the power of accumulated labour over living labour. Growth of the domination of the bourgeoisie over the working class. If wage labour produces the wealth of others that rule over it, the power that is hostile to it, capital then, the means of employment, that is, the means of subsistence, flow back to it from this hostile power, on condition that it makes itself afresh into a part of capital, into the lever which hurls capital anew into an accelerated movement of growth. To say that the interests of capital and those of the worker are one and the same is only to say that capital and wage labour are two sides of one and the same relation. The one conditions the other, just as usurer and squanderer condition each other. As long as the wage worker is a wage worker, his lot depends upon capital. That is the much vaunted community of interests between worker and capitalist. Chapter 4. If capital grows, the mass of wage labour grows, the number of wage workers grows. In a word, the domination of capital extends over a greater number of individuals. Let us assume the most favourable case. When productive capital grows, the demand for labour grows. Consequently, the price of labour, wages, goes up. A house may be large or small. As long as the surrounding houses are equally small, it satisfies all social demands for a dwelling. But let a palace arise beside the little house, and it shrinks from a little house to a hut. The little house shows now that its owner has only very slight or no demands to make, and however high it may shoot up in the course of civilization, if the neighbouring palace grows to an equal or even greater extent, the occupant of the relatively small house will feel more and more uncomfortable, dissatisfied, and cramped within its four walls. A noticeable increase in wages presupposes a rapid growth of productive capital. The rapid growth of productive capital brings about an equally rapid growth of wealth, luxury, social wants, social enjoyments. Thus, although the enjoyments of the worker have risen, the social satisfaction that they give has fallen in comparison with the increased enjoyments of the capitalist, which are inaccessible to the worker, in comparison with the state of development of society in general. Our desires and pleasures spring from society. We measure them, therefore, by society, and not by the objects which serve for their satisfaction. Because they are of a social nature, they are of a relative nature. In general, wages are determined not only by the amount of commodities for which I can exchange them, they embody various relations. What the worker receives for the labour power is, in the first place, a definite sum of money. A wage is determined only by this money price. In the 16th century, the gold and silver circulating in Europe increased as a result of the discovery of richer and more easily worked mines in America. Hence, the value of gold and silver fell in relation to other commodities. The workers received the same amount of coined silver for the labour power as before. The money price of the labour remained the same, and yet their wages had fallen. For in exchange for the same quantity of silver, they received a smaller amount of other commodities. This was one of the circumstances which furthered the growth of capital and the rise of the bourgeoisie in the 16th century. Let us take another example. In the winter of 1847, as a result of crop failure, the most indispensable means of subsistence, cereals, meat, butter, cheese, etc., rose considerably in price. Assume that the workers received the same sum of money for the labour power as before. Had not their wages fallen? Of course. For the same money they received less bread, meat, etc. in exchange. Their wages had fallen, not because the value of silver had diminished, but because the value of the means of subsistence had increased. Assume finally that the money price of labour remains the same, while all agricultural manufactured goods have fallen in price owing to the employment of new machinery, a favourable season, etc. For the same money, the workers can now buy more commodities of all kinds. Their wages, therefore, have risen, just because the value of their wages has not changed. Thus, the money price of labour, nominal wages, do not coincide with real wages, that is, with the sum of commodities which is actually given in exchange for the wages. If, therefore, we speak of a rise or fall of wages, we must keep in mind not only the money price of labour, the nominal wages, but neither nominal wages, that is, the sum of money for which the worker sells himself to capitalist, nor real wages, that is, the sum of commodities which he can buy for this money, exhaust the relations contained in wages. Wages are, above all, also determined by the relation to the gain, to the profit, of the capitalist. Comparative, relative wages. Real wages express the price of labour in relation to the price of other commodities. Relative wages, on the other hand, express the share of direct labour in the new value as created in relation to the share which falls to accumulated labour, to capital. We said above, page 19, wages are not the worker's share in the commodity produced by him. Wages are the part of already existing commodities with which the capitalist buys a definite amount of productive labour power as such. But the capitalist must replace these wages out of the price at which he sells the product produced by the worker. He must replace it in such a way that there remains to him, as a rule, a surplus over the cost of production expended by him, a profit. For the capitalist, the selling of the commodity produced by the worker is divided into three parts. First, replacement of the price of the raw materials advanced by him together with the replacement of the depreciation of the tools, machinery, and other means of labour also advanced by him. Secondly, the replacement of the wages advanced by him. And thirdly, the surplus left over, the capitalist's profit. While the first part only replaces previously existing values, it is clear that both the replacement of the wages and also the surplus profit of the capitalist are, on the whole, taken from the new value created by the worker's labour and added to the raw materials. And in this sense, in order to compare them with one another, we can regard both wages and profit as shares in the product of the worker. Real wages may remain the same, they may even rise, and yet relative wages may fall. Let us suppose, for example, that all means of subsistence have gone down in price by 2/3, or wages per day have only fallen by 1/3, that is to say, for example, from 3 marks to 2 marks. Although the worker can command a greater amount of commodities with these 2 marks than he previously could with 3 marks, yet his wages have gone down in relation to the profit of the capitalist. The profit of the capitalist, for example the manufacturer, has increased by 1 mark. That is, for a smaller sum of exchange values which he pays to the worker, the latter must produce a greater amount of exchange values than before. The share of capital relative to the share of labour has risen. The division of social wealth between capital and labour has become still more unequal. With the same capital, the capitalist commands a greater quantity of labour. The power of the capitalist class over the working class has grown. The social position of the worker has deteriorated, has been depressed one step further below that of the capitalist. What, then, is the general law which determines the rise and fall of wages and profit in their reciprocal relation? They stand in inverse ratio to each other. Capital's share, profit, rises in the same proportion as labour's share, wages, falls, and vice versa. Profits rise to the extent that wages fall. It falls to the extent that wages rise. The objection will perhaps be made that the capitalist can profit by a favourable exchange of his products with other capitalists, by increase of the demand for his commodity, whether as a result of opening of new markets, or as a result of a momentarily increased demand in the old markets, etc. That the capitalist profits can, therefore, increase by overreaching other capitalists, independently of the rise and fall of wages, of the exchange value of labour power, or that the capitalist profit may also rise owing to the improvement of the instruments of labour, a new application of natural forces, etc. First of all, it will have to be admitted that the result remains the same, although it is brought about in a reverse fashion. True, the profit has not risen because wages have fallen, but wages have fallen because the profit has risen. With the same amount of other people's labour, the capitalist has acquired a greater amount of exchange values, without having paid more for the labour on that account. This means, therefore, that labour is paid less in proportion to the net profit which it yields the capitalist. In addition, we recall that, in spite of the fluctuations in prices of commodities, the average price of every commodity, the ratio in which it is exchanged for other commodities, is determined by its cost of production. Hence the overreaching within the capitalist class necessarily balance one another. The improvement of machinery, new application of natural forces in the service of production, enable a large amount of products to be created, and in a given period of time with the same amount of labour and capital, but not by any means a larger amount of exchange values. If, by the use of the spinning jenny, I can turn out twice as much yarn in an hour as before its invention, say £100 instead of 50, then in the long run I will receive for these £100 no more commodities in exchange than formerly for the £50, because the cost of production has fallen by 1/2, or because I can deliver double the product at the same cost. Finally, in whatever proportion the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, whether of one country or of the whole world market, shares the net profit of production within itself, the total amount of this net profit always consists only of the amount by which, on the whole, accumulated labour has been increased by direct labour. This total amount grows, therefore, in the proportion in which labour augments capital, that is, in the proportion in which profit rises in comparison with wages. We see, therefore, that even if we remain within the relation of capital and wage labour, the interests of capital and the interests of wage labour are diametrically opposed. A rapid increase of capital is equivalent to a rapid increase of profit. Profit can only increase rapidly if the price of labour, if relative wages, decrease just as rapidly. Relative wages can fall, although real wages rise simultaneously with nominal wages, with the money value of labour. If they do not rise, however, in the same proportion as profit, if, for instance, in times when business is good, wages rise by 5%, profit on the other hand by 30%, then the relative wages have not increased, but decreased. Thus, if the income of the worker increases with the rapid growth of capital, the social gulf that separates the worker from the capitalist increases at the same time, and the power of capital over labour, the dependence of labour on capital, likewise increases at the same time. To say that the worker has an interest in the rapid growth of capital is only to say that the more rapidly the worker increases the wealth of others, the richer will be the crumbs that fall to him. The greater is the number of workers that can be employed and called into existence, the more can the mass of slaves, dependent on capital, be increased. We have thus seen that, even the most favourable situation for the working class, the most rapid possible growth of capital, however much it may improve the material existence of the worker, does not remove the antagonism between his interests and the interests of the bourgeoisie, the interests of the capitalist. Profit and wages remain as before, in inverse proportion. If capital is growing rapidly, wages may rise. The profit of capital rises incomparably more rapidly. The material position of the worker has improved, but at the cost of his social position. The social gulf that divides him from the capitalist has widened. Finally, to say that the most favourable condition for wage labour is the most rapid possible growth of productive capital is only to say that the more rapidly the working class increases and enlarges the power that is hostile to it, the wealth does not belong to it and that rules over it, the more favourable will be the conditions under which it is allowed to labour anew at increasing bourgeois wealth, at enlarging the power of capital, content with forging for itself the golden chains by which the bourgeoisie drags it in its train. Chapter 5. Are growth of productive capital and rise of wages really so inseparably connected as the bourgeois economists maintain? We must not take their word for it. We must not even believe them when they say that the fatter the capital is, the better will its slave be fed. The bourgeoisie is too enlightened, it calculates too well, to share the prejudices of the feudal lord who make a display by the brilliance of his retinue. The conditions of existence of the bourgeoisie compel it to calculate. We must, therefore, examine more closely. How does the growth of productive capital affect wages? If, on the whole, the productive capital of bourgeois society grows, a more manifold accumulation of labour takes place. The capitalists increase in number and extent. The numerical increase of the capitals increases the competition between the capitalists. The increasing extent of the capitals provides the means for bringing more powerful labour armies with more gigantic instruments of war into the industrial battlefield. One capitalist can drive another from the field and capture his capital only by selling more cheaply. In order to be able to sell more cheap without ruining himself, he must produce more cheaply, that is, raise the productive power of labour as much as possible. But the productive power of labour is raised, above all, by a greater division of labour, by a more universal introduction and continual improvement of machinery. The greater the labour army among whom labour is divided, the more gigantic the scale on which machinery is introduced, the more does the cost of production proportionally decrease, the more fruitful is labour. Hence, a general rivalry arises among the capitalists to increase the division of labour and machinery, and to exploit them on the greatest possible scale. If now, by a greater division of labour, by the utilisation of new machines and their improvement, by a more profitable and extensive exploitation of natural forces, one capitalist has found the means of producing with the same amount of labour, or of accumulated labour, a greater amount of products, of commodities, than his competitors, If he can, for example, produce a whole yard of linen in the same labour time in which his competitors weave half a yard, how will this capitalist operate? He could continue to sell half a yard of linen at the old market price. This would, however, be no means of driving his opponents from the field and of enlarging his own sales. But in the same measure in which his production has expanded, his need to sell has also increased. The more powerful and costly the means of production that he has called into life enable him, indeed, to sell his commodities more cheaply. They compel him, however, at the same time, to sell more commodities, to conquer a much larger market for his commodities. Consequently, our capitalist will sell his half yard of linen more cheaply than his competitors. The capitalist will not, however, sell a whole yard as cheaply as his competitors sell half a yard, although the production of the whole yard does not cost him more than half a yard costs the others. Otherwise he would not get anything extra, but only get back the cost of production by the exchange. His possibly greater income would be derived from the fact of having set a larger capital into motion, but not from having made more of his capital than the others. Moreover, he attains the object he wishes to attain if he puts the price of his goods only a small percentage lower than that of his competitors. He drives them from the field. He wrests from them at least a part of their sales by underselling them. And finally, it will be remembered that the current price always stands above or below the cost of production, according to whether the sale of the commodity occurs in a favourable or unfavourable industrial season. The percentage at which the capitalist, who has employed new and more fruitful means of production, sells above his real cost of production will vary, depending upon whether the market price of a yard of linen stands below or above its hitherto customary cost of production. However, the privileged position of our capitalist is not of long duration. Other competing capitalists introduce the same machines, the same division of labour, introduce them on the same or on a larger scale, and this introduction will become so general that the price of linen is reduced not only below its old, but below its new cost of production. The capitalists find themselves, therefore, in the same position relative to one another as before the introduction of new means of production, and if they are able to supply by these means double the product at the same price, they are now forced to supply double the product below the old price. On the basis of this new cost of production, the same game begins again. More division of labour, more machinery, enlarged scale of exploitation of machinery and division of labour, and again, competition brings the same counteraction against this result. We see how in this way, the mode of production and the means of production are continually transformed, revolutionized. How the division of labour is necessarily followed by greater division of labour, the application of machinery by still greater application of machinery, work on a large scale by work on a still larger scale. That is the law which again and again throws bourgeois production out of its old course and which compels capital to strain the productive forces of labour because it has strained them. The law which gives capital no rest and continually whispers in its ear, "Go on, go on." This law is none other than that which, within the fluctuations of trade periods, necessarily levels out the price of a commodity to its cost of production. However powerful the means of production which a capitalist brings into the field, competition will make these means of production universal, and from the moment when it has made them universal, the only result of the greater fruitfulness of his capital is that he must now supply for the same price 10, 20, 100 times as much as before. But, as he must sell perhaps 1,000 times as much as before in order to outweigh the lower selling price by the greater amount of the product sold, because a more extensive sale is now necessary, not only in order to make more profit but in order to replace the cost of production, the instrument of production itself, as we have seen, becomes more and more expensive. And because this mass scale becomes a question of life and death not only for him, but also for his rivals, the old struggle begins again, all the more violently, the more fruitful the already discovered means of production are. The division of labour, and the application of machinery, therefore, will go on anew, on an incomparably greater scale. Whatever the power of the means of production employed may be, competition seeks to rob capital of the golden fruits of this power by bringing the price of commodities back to the cost of production, by thus making cheaper production, the supply of ever greater amounts of products for the same total price, an imperative law to the same extent as production can be cheapened, that is, as more can be produced with the same amount of labour. Thus, the capitalist would have won nothing by his own exertions but the obligation to supply more in the same labour time, in a word, more difficult conditions for the augmentation of the value of his capital. While, therefore, competition continually pursues him with its law of the cost of production, and every weapon that he forges against his rivals recoils against himself, the capitalist continually tries to get the better of competition by incessantly introducing new machines, more expensive, it is true, but producing more cheaply, a new division of labour in places of the old, and by not waiting until competition has rendered the new ones obsolete. If now we picture to ourselves this feverish simultaneous agitation on the whole world market, it will be comprehensible how the growth, accumulation, and concentration of capital results in an uninterrupted division of labour, and in the application of new, and the perfecting of old, machinery, precipitately and on an ever more gigantic scale. But how do these circumstances, which are inseparable from the growth of productive capital, affect the determination of wages? The greater division of labour enables one worker to do the work of 5, 10 or 20. It therefore multiplies competition among the workers fivefold, tenfold, twentyfold. The workers do not only compete by one selling himself cheaper than one another, they compete by one doing the work of 5, 10, 20. And the division of labour, introduced by capital and continually increased, compels the workers to compete among themselves in this way. Further, as the division of labour increases, labour is simplified. The special skill of the worker becomes worthless. He becomes transformed into a simple, monotonous, productive force that does not have to bring intense bodily or intellectual facilities into play. His labour becomes a labour that anyone can perform. Hence, competitors crowd upon him on all sides, and besides, we remind the reader that the more simple and easily learned the labour is, the lower the cost of production needed to master it, the lower the wages sink, for, like the price of every other commodity, they are determined by the cost of production. Therefore, as labour becomes more unsatisfying, more repulsive, competition increases and wages decrease. The worker tries to keep up the amount of his wages by working more, whether by working longer hours or by producing more in 1 hour. Driven by want, therefore, he still further increases the evil effects of the division of labour. The result is that the more he works, the less wage he receives, and for the simple reason that he competes to the extent that his fellow workers, hence makes them into so many competitors who offer themselves on just the same bad terms as he does himself, and that, therefore, in the last resort, he competes with himself as a member of the working class. Machinery brings about the same results on a much greater scale, by replacing skilled workers by unskilled, men by women, adults by children. It brings about the same results, where it is newly introduced, by throwing the hand workers onto the streets in masses and, where it is developed, improved and replaced by more productive machinery, by discharging workers in smaller batches. We have portrayed above in a hasty sketch the industrial war of the capitalists amongst themselves. This war has the peculiarity that its battles are won less by recruiting than by discharging the army of labour. The generals, the capitalists, compete with one another as to who can discharge most soldiers of its industry. The economists tell us, it is true, that the workers rendered superfluous by machinery find new branches of employment. They dare not assert directly that the same workers who are discharged find places in new branches of labour. The fact cries out too loudly against this lie. They really only assert that new means of employment will open up for other component sections of the working class, for instance, for the portion of the young generation of workers that was ready to enter the branch of industry which has gone under. That is, of course, a great consolation for the displaced workers. The capitalist gentleman will never want for fresh exploitable flesh and blood, and will let the dead bury their dead. This is a consolation which the bourgeois give themselves, rather than one which they give the workers. If the whole class of wage workers were to be abolished owing to machinery, how dreadful that would be for capital which, without wage labour, ceases to be capital. Let us suppose, however, that those directly driven out of their jobs by machinery, and the entire section of the new generation that was already on the watch for this employment, find a new occupation. Does anyone imagine that it will be as highly paid as that which has been lost? That would contradict all the laws of economics. We have seen how modern industry always brings with it the substitution of a more simple, subordinate occupation for the more complex and higher one. How, then, could a mass of workers who have been thrown out of one branch of industry owing to machinery finding refuge in another, unless the latter is lower, worse paid? The workers who work in the manufacture of machinery itself have been cited as an exception. As soon as more machinery is demanded and used in industry, it is said, there must necessarily be an increase of machines, consequently of the manufacture of machines, and consequently of the employment of workers in the manufacture of machines, and the workers engaged in this branch of industry are claimed to be skilled, even educated workers. Since the year 1840, this assertion, which even before was only half true, has lost all semblance of truth, because ever more versatile machines have been employed in the manufacture of machinery, no more and no less than in the manufacture of cotton yarn, and the workers employed in the machinery factories, confronted by highly elaborate machines, can only play the part of highly unelaborate machines. But in place of the man who has been discharged owing to the machine, the factory employs maybe 3 children and 1 woman. And did not the man's wages have to suffice for the 3 children and a woman? Did not the minimum of wages have to suffice to maintain and to propagate the race? What then does this favourite bourgeois phrase prove? Nothing more than that now 4 times as many workers' lives are used up in order to gain a livelihood for one worker's family. Let us sum up. The more productive capital grows, the more the division of labour and the application of machinery expands. The more the division of labour and the application of machinery expands, the more competition among the workers expands, and the more the wages contract. In addition, the working class gains recruits from the higher strata of society also. A mass of petty industrialists and small rentiers are hurled down into its ranks, and have nothing better to do than urgently stretch out their arms alongside those of the workers. Thus the forest of uplifted arms demanding work becomes even thicker, while the arms themselves become even thinner. That the small industrialist cannot survive in a contest, one of the first conditions of which is to produce on an even greater scale, that is, precisely to be a large and not a small industrialist, is self-evident. That the interest on capital decreases in the same measure as the mass and number of capital increases, as capital grows, that therefore the small rentier can no longer live on his interest but must throw himself into industry, and consequently help to swell the ranks of the small industrialists, and thereby of candidates for the proletariat, all this surely requires no further explanation. Finally, as the capitalists are compelled, by the movement described above, to exploit the already existing gigantic means of production on a larger scale, and to set in motion all the mainsprings of credit to this end, there is a corresponding increase in industrial earthquakes, in which the trading world can only maintain itself by sacrificing a part of wealth, of products, and even of productive forces to the gods of the netherworld. In a word, crises increase. They become more frequent and more violent, if only because, as the mass of products, and consequently the need for extended markets, grows, the world market becomes more and more contracted. Fewer and fewer new markets remain available for exploitation, since every preceding crisis has subjected to world trade a market hitherto unconquered or only superficially exploited. But capital does not live only on labour. A lord, at once aristocratic and barbarous, it drags with it into the grave the corpses of its slaves, whole hecatomb of workers who perish in the crises. Thus we see, if capital grows rapidly, competition among the workers grows incomparably more rapidly, that is, the means of employment, the means of subsistence, of the working class, decrease proportionally so much the more, and, nevertheless, the rapid growth of capital is the most favourable condition for wage labour.